These subjective penalties, though, in the postseason, we find for the Mahomes-era Chiefs are also about 30% more likely to be called for them compared to the rest of the NFL.
So today's guest is Dr. Spencer Barnes, who's a professor of finance at the University of Texas at El Paso, aka UTEP. So, Professor Barnes, you had a study that recently came out, I believe it was in September of this year, 2025, called Under Financial Pressure. You want to give us the main findings of this study related to the Kansas City Chiefs? And also, just how did you get interested in studying the Chiefs of all teams? Like, what prompted you to think that maybe they were getting favorable calls by the referees to even start this project?
Yeah, Jesse, thanks for having me. Happy to be here. And what really led us to this is some joint work with some of my colleagues, Brandon Mendez at the University of South Carolina, and then Ted Dishman, who I went to graduate school with at Florida State University. What we typically think about in economics and finance is this idea called regulatory capture. And the easiest way to think about this is like there's a fox in the hen house where the regulators that are supposed to be, enforcing rules and laws actually end up getting regulated by the people they're supposed to be enforcing. So that's the basic idea behind regulatory capture. And this is a pretty old theory that's been going on, but it's pretty hard to test in a finance setting because everything's delayed, right? Like when a company like Walmart, for example, is cheating on its taxes or treating employees poorly, you don't really see this until 6 months, a year later, right? So it's hard to really test this. So we were thinking about it, and we're all NFL fans, and we were thinking, you know what? The NFL is a perfect regulatory environment to sort of see how regulatory capture might be affecting calls on the field. So what we thought is, well, one of the more, prominent teams for the past couple of years, one of the biggest dynasties and the most valuable teams has been the Chiefs. So from anecdotal evidence, we've seen that people think that there might be some favoritism going on. And if the NFL has financial incentives to keep one team very prominent, then this might influence the way that officials are calling games and providing us with some great evidence that regulatory capture can influence how people enforce rules and laws.
So just reading from the abstract, just to make this fairly concise for the audience, you'd say that analyzing 13,136 defensive penalties from 2015 to 2023, we find that the postseason officiating disproportionately favors the Mahomes-era Kansas City Chiefs, coinciding with the team's emergence as a key driver of TV viewership/ratings and thereby revenue. Our study suggests that financial reliance on dominant entities can alter enforcement dynamics, a concern with implications far beyond sports governance. So do you want to talk a little bit about like the team and how you actually went through and analyzed these 13,136 defensive penalties and what made you come to the conclusion that the Chiefs did have a disproportionate impact by the referees, I guess you could say?
Yeah, so this penalty data is all publicly available out on GitHub, so anybody interested can go get it and look at it. And what we end up creating is called a panel data set where you're able to view each penalty in the game across all of these years. And we end up employing what's called a fixed effect model. It's a statistical model that lets us sort of look within different scenarios to get the average effect for the Chiefs and for all compared to all other teams in the NFL. And so, for example, if you might be concerned that the home team gets favorable calls, we're able to look within the setting of having a home team to make sure that this effect is not driving our results. And so using this methodology, we find that in the postseason, when the viewership and ratings are the highest, that the Chiefs do seem to get more favorable calls and are, in terms of significance and magnitude, the Chiefs are getting, maybe 4 yards more per penalty, which doesn't sound like a lot, right? And maybe it's leading to one more call during the game. But the postseason games are often determined by a field goal. And if you get one more call that can extend the drive of your offense, that has potential for game altering outcomes. And so that's sort of what we do with our 13,000 penalties. We split it between the regular season and the postseason. And we find that the Mahomes-era Chiefs, compared to the rest of the NFL, even when you're holding things constant, seem to get favorable treatment and favorable calls from the refs compared to other teams.
Isn't the average margin of victory in the NFL something like a field goal?
Yeah, I mean, even during the regular season, it's like a field goal, and especially in the postseason. I mean, if you watch postseason's game, especially after the wild card, the parity between the teams is so close that, I mean, one of these calls that could lead to a first down has game-altering outcomes.
This is early on in this article. I'm just going to read this. But you say that in 2024, the NFL generated approximately $23 billion in revenue, an amount that would rank it around 150th among S&P 500 firms based on that year's revenue, which you say is comparable to 3M Waste Management and Halliburton. Thus, the NFL provides, basically you're saying it provides a pretty good setting to test if financial pressures associated with rule enforcement. Then I also found it interesting where you talk a lot about how, I believe it was in the 2015, 2016, 2017 seasons where we had, Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, and it seemed like a lot of politics got into the NFL, and where you mentioned that those seasons had a lower rating where they actually lost quite a few million viewers per game, which is a pretty big chunk. And then I believe in this paper in the playoffs, you're talking, was it the Chiefs average about 4 million more views than other teams? So it's a pretty noticeable difference. So it does definitely seem like when you're talking about $23 billion in revenue, a top 150 company, certainly would be hard not to think of the financial component.
Yeah, that's one of the, we do say in the paper, there are like, hundreds of other explanations going on here to explain what we might be finding, right? But what we really think is like, look, the referees are employees of the NFL, right? And if you've been an employee for a company and you're thinking in the back of your mind, what's the best way to make my company successful, right? Because I don't want my company to go under, because then I get fired and I have to go find another job, right? I don't want that to happen. But also, you're not doing everything on a day-to-day basis with that at the forefront of your mind. It's always sort of in the back of your mind, right? And so, yeah, when you look at a company that generates 23, $24 billion in revenue, puts it up there with, almost in the top 100 of majorly publicly traded companies, then yeah, I mean, these refs are going to have some thoughts in the back of their mind that we want to make sure that the relevant viewership and rating TV generating team is going to sort of stay at the top there.
On this paper, the under financial pressure, it's, yourself as you're the lead researcher along with Brandon Mendez and Ted. It was a Dishman.
Yeah.
Did you have like graduate researchers, graduate students as well? I mean, like, how big was this team? It looks like you're looking at a lot of analytics, a lot of data going back for 9 seasons in the NFL. That's a lot of, you're comparing the regular season to the playoffs. You even then take a look at Alex Smith, the quarterback before Patrick Mahomes, to see if Andy Reid, had a different, say, coaching style and see how that impacted, which I thought was interesting. So, I mean, you're basically looking at like over a decade of games. I mean, how big is this team? You must have to have, I would imagine, some graduate research assistants to help out combing through all these games here.
Yeah, Jesse, actually it was just us three. We're all pretty proficient at computer coding, and also the GitHub repository that we use is called NFL Verse. So once again, if any listeners are interested in looking at NFL data themselves, it's all publicly available and out there, and it's already collected. You just sort of have to pull it down and work with it a little bit. So thankfully to NFL Verse, they've done a large portion of what you would typically need a team of graduate students helping out in order to get that done. But we were able to use NFL Verse and sort of just pull it down from there. So thankfully that wasn't too big of a concern and too big of a problem. But yeah, go into your comment on the, one of the reasons that we might be finding what we find is because it's Andy Reid, right? Maybe he has a specific coaching style compared to the rest of the coaches in the NFL that just help his team get penalties called more often. And that's a totally, valid reason to explain what we're finding. But yeah, we basically compare the penalties when Alex Smith was the quarterback at Kansas City with Andy Reid as the head coach, and we don't find anything, right? From a statistical perspective, we don't find any difference between the Chiefs and other teams when Alex Smith was their quarterback and Andy Reid was the head coach.
So what would you say are the 3 to 5 most shocking stats that would give the fans some good kind of reference point, data points to be able to prove the case that the Chiefs are getting these calls in the playoffs from the referees? What would be a handful of these stats?
Yeah, so they're sort of like, two to three, right? First of all, the main finding is that in the postseason, right? In the regular season, we actually find that the Chiefs don't get any, better calls compared to the rest of the league. They actually somewhat get less yardage per call, less likely to get a first down. But in the postseason, when these games really matter, we find that there's about a 20% increase, percentage point increase in the probability that the Chiefs get a first down on a penalty call compared to the rest of the league. So, once again, that's a drive extending call. And when you're talking about the postseason and it's 3 points on the margin, 20% more likely is a pretty good number, right? We also find that probably one of the more interesting ones is we find that subjective penalty calls. So these are penalty calls like roughing the passer, right, which we all know is a Mahomes sort of phenomenon. Defensive pass interference. These types of calls that are subjective more than, if you see an offsides, if you see a false start, that's easy to call, right? It's sort of cut clear and dry. These subjective penalties, though, in the postseason, we find for the Mahomes-era Chiefs are also about 30% more likely to be called for them compared to the rest of the NFL. And then the last big thing that we sort of find is that refs that were previously officiating a postseason game for the Mahomes-era Kansas City Chiefs, if they are in the following year, if they are on a NFL ref squad that is officiating a Chiefs game, the calls for those games also benefit the Chiefs more than compared to referee crews that do not have a previous referee that was officiating a postseason game for the Chiefs.
See, when you're talking about, say, regulatory capture, and you're mentioning about how it's these refs that have reffed previous games that are giving them these beneficial calls. Do you think this is coming down from the NFL then, or is this at a subconscious level? Or do these refs know what they're doing? Or does the NFL just select refs that have? I mean, basically, I guess the question that people would be asking is the NFL rigging these games, or is this at a subconscious level? I mean, what's the answer to that?
Yeah, so when we're in the paper, we're incredibly careful here, right? We make no claims that the NFL's rigging anything because that's impossible to prove, right? What we're arguing is that it seems that it's at a subconscious level, right? Is once again, who's the most valuable team? We show with data that since Mahomes has been the quarterbacks for the Chiefs, they get higher ratings and they get higher viewership numbers for TV. And the main revenue driver of the NFL is TV contracts, right? So we're making argument that this is probably more at the subconscious level, and we don't make any claims about NFL rigging anything or whatnot, just because we can't speak to that and we can't really show that. And then also, I've heard some comments every now and then that the way that refs get propagated through the season and into the postseason is if they perform better, right? Like if they call a good game, they're more likely to get to referee the Super Bowl or more likely to get to referee the AFC Championship. If you go look around the internet or around the NFL website, it is almost impossible to find what those reward system is, right? So it's very, very hard to figure out, well, why is this referee getting, to referee the Super Bowl and another referee's not, right? Like, what are those subjective measures that the NFL is using? They don't state them anywhere. You can't find them, right? So we're not saying that it's rigged or anything. We're more of making the argument that it's sort of an implicit bias in the back of their head. But yeah, I mean, that could be future research that other people could explore.
You mentioned the year 2018 as when the Chiefs started getting the favorable calls from the refs, which is also the first year you mentioned when Patrick Mahomes became the starting quarterback for the Chiefs. But it's also 2018 is the year that gambling was essentially deregulated by the U.S. Supreme Court. Before, only Vegas could have sports betting, and then the Supreme Court essentially deregulated it, making it up to the states to decide if they wanted to have this. So I find that the year is interesting. You didn't mention anything about gambling in the paper, and you had a more narrow focus. But do you think there could be any connection, or is that just a coincidence that this was both happening in 2018?
Yeah. So we kept a very narrow focus in the paper, right? Where we were basically trying to ask one question and look at, sort of a few different outcomes. But yeah, I mean, with what we're seeing with the NBA right now, in terms of sports betting, at the end of the day, these are entertainment companies, right? That's what these are. They're the WWE is an entertainment company. So the NFL is listed as an entertainment company, right? So if we're thinking about betting and something like this is happening, I mean, there is a ton of money that gets bet on NFL games on a week to week basis. And, if you are finding differences between the way that games are called for a specific team, this only doesn't have, implications for the players and the outcomes. It has implications for people who are betting a lot of their income on the outcome of these games. And, it coincides with when Patrick Mahomes became their quarterback. But no, in the context of our setting, we didn't really explore that. And we aren't able to really say if anything's going on there. But it does make you question that if you are a gambler and you're gambling on these sports, you might want to be a little bit careful and think a little bit more about what you're doing, for some of the outcomes of these games.
And the other thing I noticed that you didn't mention in the article was Taylor Swift. And I guess when Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce started dating, all of a sudden the Chiefs also had higher ratings. And it was just interesting because you'd be watching a Chiefs game and like after every play, they'd be like panning to Taylor Swift in the box. It's like, oh, I'm not really sure what panning to Taylor Swift has to do with this game. But apparently they were increasing ratings. And I remember I was out talking to a friend after it was, known that Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce were dating. And I was like, I guarantee you right now, the Kansas City Chiefs will be in the Super Bowl. It's like, I guarantee it. The NFL wants this, or they want to get the younger crowd, get more females watching. Did you guys think at all about maybe looking at the Taylor Swift factor in the ref calls in that era? I mean, this is more of a recent phenomenon, not going back to 2018. This is just the last couple of years. But if you did some research on that, what do you think that would find?
Yeah, my colleague Brandon really wanted to actually test that question with our data. Unfortunately, when we started this project, doing academic research takes a really long time. So when we started this project, the only data that we had available was up to 2023. And so we were unable to test, is there a Taylor Swift phenomenon going on as well, where TV ratings and revenue go up even higher for the Chiefs. We weren't able to test that, but we really wanted to. I mean, anecdotally, like if you look at this stuff, yeah, my some of the people I know that have no interest in the NFL all overnight became sort of NFL fans, right? So, just looking from a outside perspective without actually looking at hard data, it looks like this might be an effect going on, but we'll have to give it a few more years, wait for the data to show up. And then when it does, yeah, maybe we could do a Taylor Swift paper.
Also, you mentioned in this paper how you tested other dynasties to test if this is just the dynasty effect. The most obvious example that predated the Chiefs would have been the Tom Brady led Patriots. And you went through that as well and found that the Patriots and Tom Brady weren't getting any special calls. I mean, what do you think is the reason that they weren't getting any special calls. I mean, but also a lot of people at the time thought that the Patriots were getting calls. I mean, it seems like any team that's winning, there's this perception that the league is helping them out. I mean, most, notably, like, say if you go to the NBA, it's like Michael Jordan. I mean, Michael Jordan could take 4 steps and he wouldn't get called for traveling. People weren't paying $1,000 a ticket to see Michael Jordan foul out of the game. Just like people aren't going to Kansas City to Arrowhead to pay a bunch of money to see Travis Kelce get ejected or Patrick Mahomes, get knocked out of a game, get concussed or whatever. So it does seem like the NFL does try to protect its superstars a little bit more. And if Travis Kelce if Patrick Mahomes is the face of the NFL, I guess you could see that maybe the NFL will ref him a little bit differently than, a lesser known quarterback or a quarterback that's not actually putting fans in the stands, so to speak.
Yeah, so another explanation of what's going on and what we're finding is that, well, maybe it's the fact that this is, it's all dynasties, right? Like maybe every best team is getting favorable calls too, because what do people like to watch? They, as you just said, they like to watch the best players, right? And they like to watch the best teams. And so maybe it's just a dynasty effect, right? And it's not specifically for the Chiefs and for the Mahomes-era Chiefs, right? So what we do is, we look at the Tom Brady led Patriots in the earlier parts of the sample. And then also, even concurrent with the Chiefs, we look at some other close to dynasty teams, you could say, like the Eagles, the Rams, the Niners, that have had runs to where they're sort of going to back-to-back Super Bowls, or every other year they're in the Super Bowl. And basically what we find is across those other dynasties, we don't really find an effect, either in the regular season or the postseason, which sort of suggests that something special is going on with the Chiefs, right? The fact that we're not finding it for these other teams. And what we try to say is that when Tom Brady was the quarterback for the Patriots, the NFL was doing really well financially. It was really about that, as you said, towards the beginning of the podcast, it's really that 2016 era where it really started falling off. And you can look at the data. Viewership falls off. TV revenue falls off. Ratings fall off, right? And, this was when Tom Brady was sort of at his end of his career with the Patriots. And, maybe it was a case where the league was looking for a new sort of market and a new team to sort of prop up TV viewership and revenue during that politically tense time. Once again, we can't, unfortunately, with the data that we have, we can't say for certain if that is what's going on. But, I think looking at the results we find, it's not too far of a stretch to sort of think that might be the case.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about roughing the passer calls, which are pretty subjective. And Sports Illustrated, they did some research, and Sports Illustrated found that Patrick Mahomes averages 0.412 roughing the passer penalties per game in the playoffs, which is by far the highest among all active quarterbacks. And it says that the average quarterback in the postseason gets a roughing the passer at 0.12 per game. So Patrick Mahomes is like 3 times that. But, you could be like, well, he's, a mobile quarterback. He's athletic. He's running around. Maybe he puts himself in opportunities where he's more likely to get it. But then you look at someone like Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson has 0 roughing the passer penalties in the playoffs. And not only this, but Tom Brady, who played 23 years in the NFL, has less roughing the passer penalties than Patrick Mahomes does in his vastly shorter career. And that's a pretty subjective thing, a pretty subjective penalty. I remember in, some previous playoff games, I mean, Patrick Mahomes, and like just the way he does it, though, I wonder if it's kind of a technique, is he'll run and be along the sideline. And if you look like you're going to hit him, then he'll just like flop. Or if you're not going to tackle him, he'll just keep running. It's like the way that he does it, where Tom Brady, especially towards the end of his career, same thing with Peyton Manning, I mean, they would essentially just fall down.
Yeah.
But the fact is, like, Lamar Jackson's also running around. How does he have 0? And Patrick Mahomes is 3 times higher than any active quarterback. I mean, I find that stat to be pretty insane. And do you want to kind of talk about the roughing the passer?
Yeah, sure. So we didn't, do a deep dive into specific subjective penalties like Sports Illustrated, but what we did do is just sort of classify, hey, which defensive penalties in our data set are actually classified as subjective, right? And what we find there is that the Mahomes-era Chiefs, especially in the postseason, exactly what you're saying right there, right, are way more likely to get subjective penalty calls compared to the rest of the league in the postseason. And once again, when you're talking about subjective penalty calls, these are penalty calls that are an automatic first down, right? Like it is by definition extending the drive. And that is leading to game altering consequences. Yeah, it might not be that the team that gets the subjective call gets points on that drive, but think about it. I mean, that's at least going to take another 2 minutes off the clock. That's going to alter how the offense, the opposing offense, comes back out on the field, especially if it's towards the end of the game, right? So, if it's leading to extending drives, then it's changing the outcome towards the end of the game. And if that's the case, then yeah, getting point four, point four doesn't sound like much, but it just takes one, right? It just takes one call to alter the postseason outcomes of these games where the teams are so closely comparable to each other. So yeah, I mean, I think these subjective calls, that was one of the key insights of our paper. I think that I found really interesting is that these subjective calls from the referees really do seem to be benefiting the Chiefs in the postseason.
Yeah, and you mentioned also the pass interference, which I mean that's a very subjective call. I think the problem with the pass interference is that it's an automatic first down. Hypothetically, you could have a 3rd and 15. Patrick Mahomes could be, say, sacked on this play, but there's maybe some incidental contact, or it looks like a receiver and a DB kind of get tangled up, whatever, so to speak, has nothing to do with the play. That the flag is thrown, and all of a sudden now instead of being 4th and 22, whatever, it's 1st and 10, and it's just like those plays are massive to me. Like I would think of, I mean, I don't know if I believe I had Sean Patrick Griffin on, who wrote a book talking about Tim Donahue, who was the ref that was fixing games back in the early 2000s, back when Jordan, Shaq, Kobe were playing. And I asked him, what sport do you think is the easiest to rig without really being super obvious? And it seems like football and basketball are the two sports that are by far, the ref influences the game immensely in those two sports. Any play you could throw kind of a flag on a receiver and a DB getting tangled up, and it completely changes the game.
Yeah, and that's sort of one of the takeaways of our paper is that, hey, if you're in a situation where the people who are supposed to be regulating the outcome of whatever you're looking at, right? In our case, it's NFL games, but it could also be stock trading. It could also be, trading between two countries, right? If the person that is getting paid to regulate this stuff has any type of financial incentive, then we need to be really careful about how we think about setting up the regulatory environment for those people. And so in our case, it's for the officials. And if you remember a few years ago, the NFL implemented something where coaches could actually challenge referee calls, right? The NFL got rid of that really quickly, right? That did not last. It lasted one season. And also, if you watched any of those calls, it was never overturned, right? The refs were always right. So it's something where the NFL should think about. We have replays to make sure, is that actually a touchdown? Did he actually fumble the ball? Right? We have that technology. Why are we not doing something to ensure the fairness of the game between both teams, to make it to where the calls from the referees are so subjective? And even if you look at a replay, right? Like the thing that's going on right now is the tush push, right? With the Eagles, where the Eagles are clearly doing false starts, right? They're getting a half a yard step in front of the defense, and the refs don't call it. But if you look at the replay, it's right there. It's plain as day. Why is the NFL not doing something to where, we can make the calls more fair between teams, right? I think that's one of the big takeaways from our papers, that any setting where regulatory capture might be possible, we need to be really careful about how we think about implementing rules to ensure fairness and equity across outcomes.
You're mentioning the tush push, which I think next year it will probably be banned. I mean, I think they had a ban on it as offseason. Yeah. Yeah. And they were only a handful of votes away from actually passing that. But do you think if it was, say, like the Carolina Panthers, a team like that, or I don't know, say the Cleveland Browns or something, that they'd be officiating that differently? Or you do just think that play, the tush push, is so hard to officiate?
Yeah, and going back to the previous comment about like which sports would be easiest to do this type of stuff. Yeah, I mean it's definitely NBA and NFL because like if you think about soccer, right? They have goal line technology, right? They also have that technology where if somebody calls an offsides, they have a line running down, right? And they double check to make sure that it was offsides. You think about the MLB, right? They're almost to the point where there's talks of like, do we even need umpires on the field anymore, right? Because our cameras can sort of capture what's considered the box for each specific batter, what's considered the foul line, right? So like, those areas are starting to get harder and harder to potentially rig games and influence outcomes. To where in the NFL, yeah, there's just not much, and I even think that if it was a different team, right, like even if it was the Browns or the Panthers or the Titans, right, it's like some of these other teams that are not very good. I still think it would be really hard for them to officiate just because you have that many people that close to the line and it's a half a second play, right? It is just so hard to see with human eyes who's moving early and who's not. But if you have a camera sitting up above, right? They have the sky cam sitting up above, then yeah, it'd be really easy to tell, oh, that's offside, stop the play, 5 yards back, now you redo it, right? And now you have 5 yards to go instead of half a yard. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I really think after, what we found in this paper, I really think that as a fan of the game, it would be really nice to see some changes in order to make sure that referees don't have such a big impact on the outcome of these games.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially with the more technology, AI, and whatnot. But yeah, baseball is just a lot significantly easier to say kind of automate the umpire or the referee. I mean, even like this year where the NFL now has a focus of unsportsmanlike conduct, they don't want taunting and things like that. But you'll have Patrick Mahomes will, flex his muscle or something like that after a touchdown pass. That's fine. But then another player does the exact same thing, and then they're getting flagged for taunting, unsportsmanlike conduct. So it just seems like everything is so subjective. But I think that's what the NFL wants. I just feel like the NFL is, of all the, I mean, essentially, like I had this guest, Dr. Fergus Connolly, on. He's the only coach to have worked full time in every major sport. He's from Europe, but he's worked in the NFL. He's worked in the Premier League. He's worked in rugby, college, and we were talking about. He basically says, that the NFL is a soap opera for men, and in his book, he has this quote. And in one of his books, I think this book was Game Changers, but he says that sports as a product is entertainment first and foremost. I've often said that the most advanced sport in the world is WWE wrestling. It is pure entertainment. This is the direction that most professional sports are heading in. They are entertainment entities first, sport teams second.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a really interesting take because you think about the teams that drive revenue for the NFL. What's the most valuable team in the world? It's the Dallas Cowboys. And actually about a month or two ago, Jerry Jones actually said, "Yeah, we're running a soap opera." Right? Like he said those exact words. He said soap opera, right? And so if in an owner's opinion, how am I getting a valuable team? Well, it's people talking about my team. Right. So how do I make that happen? Well, I make sure that somebody like Michael Parsons, one of the best defenders in the league, I have some big falling out with him. Then everybody's talking about the Cowboys. Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think that, if sports leagues are moving to more entertainment focused entities, which they are, then maybe they don't care so much how the games are officiated, which once again, going back to what we talked earlier about betting, If that's the case, then, as a bettor, you need to factor in, oh, some of these games might not be called fairly. If I'm making bets with my money, I need to be, taking that into account.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a gambler, you definitely want as neutral officiating as possible. Don't they estimate something like $30 billion in 2025 is going to be wagered on NFL games? I mean, that's even more than the entire NFL makes in revenue. I mean, or in profit, I should say. I mean, that's insanity.
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy. So that's one of the things where if you're trying to make bets on outcomes of games, especially in the postseason, our paper's sort of showing like, hey, if you're betting against the Chiefs, you might want you might want to think twice, right? You might want to consider how the refs play into the whole picture and what you might need to do there.
So you're in Texas, right? You're at the University of Texas, El Paso. Where are you from originally?
Yeah, so I'm from Arkansas. I was born and raised in Arkansas, grew up there, and then I went to undergrad in Nashville, Tennessee, and then I did my grad school in Tallahassee, Florida. So and now I'm out in El Paso, Texas.
Right. So do you ever just get accused of being a chief hater or anything like that? I mean, what's kind of some of the pushback that you've gotten on this? And have a lot of people reached out to you? Or I mean, what's kind of been the media reaction since your paper came out? I think your date on it is September 6th, 2025. So fairly recent, only a couple months ago.
Yeah, fairly recent. It took a while for it to gain some steam, but no, I mean, a lot of news outlets started picking it up and whatnot. I've had a few interviews like this one, right? Just sort of talk a little bit more about it. Overall, the sort of like you've been, right? The interviewers have been very neutral, right? Just trying to figure out what's going on with the paper. Let's talk about it a little bit. But then, yeah, like on some of the social media platforms where it's been posted, yes, there's definitely been comments that were, just chief haters and that we're just trying to find whatever we can with the data. And, that first of all, that's not true, right? We were being very scientific with our method. That's what we learn when we're getting our PhDs. How do you remain neutral even in a situation where people might think you're being biased? So we did try to remain as neutral as possible. But yeah, we definitely have been getting some chief hater comments. But some of the comments that we're getting out there is that like, oh, you find that this leads to like one more call per game. So who cares, right? Like that's not a big effect. You can't really say that the Chiefs are getting favorable treatment. As we've said over and over in this podcast, right? One more call can lead to a first down, which can lead to 3 points, which can win a postseason game, right? So that's one thing that we've been talking about a lot. Also, I'd like to point out that our method, our statistical method that we use, takes into account averages. So something that a lot of people have failed to understand is that the Chiefs have played more playoff games with Patrick Mahomes, right? So therefore, people think on average, it would just be more likely that they're getting calls just because they've played more games. The statistical method that we use actually takes into account how many penalty calls the Chiefs have gotten and make sure it's to factor that in. And so we're actually finding what we call the average treatment effect of Chiefs penalty calls to others, which takes into account that the Chiefs have played more games. So, yeah, we've gotten some comments on social media platforms that have not been too nice, but it's just part of it.
I'm from Wisconsin originally. I mean, I haven't lived in Wisconsin since university, but I'm a Packers fan, obviously. So I'm fairly neutral because I could really care less about the AFC. The only time I would really care is if the Packers were playing, say, the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. But I do watch a lot of NFL games, and I'm actually kind of surprised you find the results that say in the postseason, the Chiefs get favorable calls from the refs, but you say during the regular season, they do not. But even when I watch Chiefs games in the regular season, I tend to find that they get some pretty ridiculous calls that I don't see other teams getting. And just like even the way that the announcers talk about Mahomes, like he'll make like a 4-yard check down, and the announcer will be basically like creaming their pants. It's like, oh my God, did you see this throw that Patrick Mahomes? Like only one quarterback in the world can make that throw. And it's like, you just made a 4-yard check down. Every quarterback makes that throw. I feel like there's just like this love affair I feel like it's almost more with Patrick Mahomes, and then it just intensified with Kelsey and the whole Taylor Swift kind of love connection, but I'm seeing just regular throws, and I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, one of the worst commentators that does that, which is one of my least favorite ones, is Chris Collinsworth. I mean, that guy, just anytime Patrick Mahomes, he's calling a Patrick Mahomes game, it's tough to listen to. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just, once again, if you're, and yes, these guys work for ESPN. Yes, these guys work for Fox. They work for ABC. But I mean, those people are also interested in making sure that the NFL does well, because how does ABC get money? Well, it means more people are watching ABC channels, right? And so yeah, even the announcers probably have some incentives in the back of their mind, financial incentives to make a certain player look better and sound better than other players out there. So yeah, that's something, and we were surprised that in the regular season we did not find an effect. We actually found the opposite effect, that they get less favorable calls in the regular season for the Mahomes-era Chiefs. We were sort of surprised by that. We don't really have a good explanation on why that's the case, on why that's happening. Because you're definitely right, especially this year so far during the regular season, some of those Chiefs games, yeah, it looks like they're getting favorable calls. So we can't really speak. We tried to think about it and tried to sort of find out why that was the case, but we couldn't really find anything to explain why that was sort of showing up in the data. So we're not really sure there.
You mentioned earlier about how, like, yeah, some people don't think, one play here or, 4-point swing or whatever makes that big of a difference. I remember watching the Chiefs when they beat the Eagles in the Super Bowl, not this past Super Bowl, but was that like 7 years back? And I thought that that wasn't 7 years back, but it was in 2023. And I remember watching that game and I was like, man, the Eagles should win this game by 2 touchdowns. And it seemed like they got screwed on numerous calls, and the Chiefs won that game 38-35. You're talking a 3-point swing. I mean, the refs could easily make that happen. I thought that the Eagles were going to win that game by 14 points at least.
Yeah. And that's actually when this idea for this research question was sort of born. Is that I actually watched that Super Bowl at a party with my colleague Ted. And we had the same exact thought, is like, the Eagles are clearly the better team. They clearly outplayed. And then some of the calls in that game were insane. Like, they were really, really bad calls. And of course, as we've talked about previously, you can't do anything about it, right? You just have to accept it and move on. But it has game altering consequences. And so that's actually when we sort of first started thinking about this paper. And, as I told you, we didn't publish it until 2025. It takes a long time to publish these academic articles. There's a lot of thinking and process that goes on to get these things done. But yeah, that is actually the game that sort of inspired this paper, because that, when we were watching that, we were like, man, something isn't right here. I'm thinking that it's probably a financial incentive. Let's see if we can test that and figure out what's going on.
ABC also owns ESPN, and ABC, of course, has Monday Night Football. But then you have all the different kind of sport program shows. I mean, Fox, which has a bunch of NFL games, also has Fox Sports Network as well. So they're kind of cross-pollinating. And I always kind of wondered, in terms of sports radio, sports TV, where I kind of mentioned before how a lot of these announcers kind of cream their pants over Patrick Mahomes. And we're talking about that Eagles game. If the Eagles win that game, that means that Patrick Mahomes has another Super Bowl loss. And all of a sudden now, instead of having, they're trying to be like, oh, he's the GOAT. Now you can have these debates over Patrick Mahomes or Tom Brady, who's the greatest quarterback at this point in their career. And now all of a sudden, if you're the Eagles quarterback, Jalen Hurts would have 2 Super Bowl rings, Patrick Mahomes would have 2, and now all of a sudden, because a lot of these sports announcers like to use the team wins as a quarterback stat, which I find to be ridiculous. I mean, you have 33 guys on a field, including special teams, and how many games are won and lost based on a kicker? I mean, like, people would be like, oh, it's 22. Well, it's not 22. It's 33. The kickers have a massive impact. But I feel like a lot of the sports talk radio, a lot of the ESPN conversations would be a lot different if it could just, and that, like the NFL, like we talk about, is soap opera for men. But a big part of that is like, now, the NFL draft is this big event. The offseason has these big events. So getting these conversations talking, even when the NFL isn't on, like a lot of this has to do with having Patrick Mahomes, keep going back to the Super Bowl, having him win more rings than he really should have. I feel like even that, like just the whole hoopla around the NFL would be less if they didn't have that success. Do you think I mean, obviously you didn't study this, but what's your general thoughts on that angle of it?
Yeah, so I mean that's actually a really good point because if the Chiefs had not won that Super Bowl, then you wouldn't have. I mean, if you remember this past Super Bowl, how much airtime and talk show time was spent on can the Chiefs do a three-peat? Right? There hasn't been a three-peat since before. There's only been one before, right? And that generates so much excitement, and so even for people who don't like the NFL. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, this team's about to do something that hasn't been done in forever, right? Like just think about the Triple Crown for horse racing. The people that aren't interested in horse racing all of a sudden get really interested if a horse has a chance to do that, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think if you're looking at a media perspective, right, which is the main way that the NFL drives revenue, then yeah, creating these stories and these storylines definitely have a financial incentive for the league. And that could be something that, once again, in the back of the minds of these referees, maybe something like that is going on, right? Where just at the margin, you're making one more call because you're thinking about this, that then leads to 3 more points, that then lets you win a Super Bowl by 38-35. Instead of losing it, by by 3 points, right? So, yeah, I think there's something there that, of course, we don't look at that in the paper, but once again, these what we're trying to show in the paper is that financial incentives. We need to be really sort of cautious about how people are enforcing these rules.
You are a finance professor, so you are kind of using this to look at, say, regulatory capture. And with this as being on TV, like you mentioned, you have a lot more transparency. It's a lot easier to look at this than, say, go through someone's, company's like 10K form, or even, they'd have to even be a publicly traded company to even have access to that. But even looking at a company's, say, 10K form, it's still pretty opaque. And who even knows if they're not being, say, fraudulent. Look at a company like Enron or something. It wasn't that the whole reason Warren Buffett didn't invest in it, because he's like, I read the 10K form and I didn't understand it. Like, if Warren Buffett doesn't understand it, there's probably maybe something fraudulent at the very least, or something wrong with it. It's a pretty good indicator. But like, yeah, I probably should stay away from this. So how does this research under financial pressure, studying the NFL, how does this factor into the larger financial world and regulatory capture and things like that? I imagine you're spending more time than just studying NFL games here, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you got the best job in the world. I mean, I'll go to El Paso and study some football with you if that's
Yeah, no. Yeah, so I'm doing a lot more than just studying the NFL. Looking at corporate outcomes across different regulations and whatnot. But yeah, really, I think the big takeaway from using the NFL, the reason we used it is because in economics and finance, right? Like, as a finance professor, I'm not able to do like what a chemistry professor can do, where they can go into the lab and run the same experiment 1,000 times to verify their results, right? Like, I can't do that. So if I do want to test something like regulatory capture, and I know that in the financial world that everything's delayed and it's opaque and it's hard to figure out, and even people like Warren Buffett might have trouble figuring out, right? Then I need to find what, a quote unquote laboratory in order to test something, right? And the reason that we looked at the NFL is because, as you said, everything's transparent. It happens in real time. It's recorded. It's in front of millions of people. It has game-altering outcomes. And so when you make these parallels to the financial regulatory environment, then it's really as close as we can get. And that's why sports is really helpful in order to figure out what might be going on in the financial world. And so the takeaway of using the NFL is, even though it's not a one-to-one match of what, maybe the SEC commission is doing, or maybe the other type of regulatory bodies out there are doing, what we can do is we can learn a little bit about what might be going on out in the financial world from using things like sports. And the big takeaway from the paper and using the NFL in this setting is, if there is money involved, right? If there is a financial outcome, we need to be really, really careful in how we train our regulators to make sure that they don't get influenced by the people they're supposed to be regulating, right? And you can see, like, this happens in the financial world. You mentioned Enron, right? That's one that's definitely happened. Actually, one of the big causes of the '08 financial crisis, right, is that the companies that were supposed to be regulating and providing bond ratings to these publicly traded companies, like Moody's and S&P, they get paid by the companies that they're providing the bond ratings for. And so if I don't provide a good rating to the company that I'm looking at, they'll just go to a different company, and then I lose revenue. Right. So if I'm financially reliant on a certain outcome, then, I'm going to be influenced with the way that I regulate things. And so I think that's, what we're trying to do. Even though I'm a finance professor, not a sports journalism professor or something like that, it was a good laboratory that we could use in order to get some information empirically about how regulatory capture works.
Have you had any major outlets reach out to you at all? Or has it been more like small podcasts, like this podcast, your all podcast?
Yeah. So as far as the interviews gone, it's been sort of like local radio stations, smaller podcasts and stuff. I mean, I think maybe the biggest outlet that's sort of talked about our work has been Pardon My Take from Barstool Sports. So they covered it just a little bit, but they haven't reached out or anything. So it's basically been, if people are covering it, they're either sort of talking about it by themselves, or they're writing an article about it. And so, it has shown up in the India Times, which is sort of India's version of the New York Times. It showed up in the Independent, which is like the UK's version of the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. So it's shown up in some pretty big outlets, some media outlets, but it's typically just somebody writing about it. And it's mostly been smaller outlets that have reached out to us.
I find that to be interesting, just because I was doing some research before this podcast. After we agreed to do this podcast, I was like, oh, okay, I'll see what other podcasts he's on. I'm sure some other big outlets reached out to Dr. Spencer Barnes, and turns out not. It was actually not really much out there. And I mentioned that the previous podcast that I did with Dr. Furness Connolly, and I read you the quote talking about how essentially he talked about how the model of sports going forward is going to be more like the WWE, and how the NFL is essentially a soap opera for men. And I have something like 100 and I forget the exact number, but like 163 podcasts or something like that. And of the 163 podcasts I have, over 25% of them are restricted on YouTube, which essentially means that they're not safe to be unrestricted and have access to everybody. And if it's restricted, doesn't show up in search, or it's hard to find in search, and it's not going to be suggested, which is where a lot of people watch their videos. So of course YouTube doesn't tell you the reason why, but the video with the podcast with Dr. Fergus Connolly was also restricted. And so I was like, ultimately he's a performance coach, so it had a lot more to do with talking about how to be just a better athlete. But that was just something I found interesting from his book, so I asked him about it. But I ran that transcript through ChatGPT-5 to see why was this podcast about how to just be a better athlete restricted on YouTube. And it said basically that exact quote that I read to him, that essentially it made it look bad, for the NFL. And I'm thinking, like, as we mentioned before, I mean, why would ESPN want to cover this? Like, or Fox, where you got people like Nick Wright that has, when on his show First Things First, where he talks about the Mahomes Mountain and all this stuff. It seems like the Mahomes Mountain would kind of crumble when he's getting all these favorable calls that other quarterbacks aren't getting. I mean, I guess in Nick Wright's defense, though, I mean, he's like from that area, so he's kind of a homer that just happens to have a big national platform. Which, I mean, I don't know, if I was on national radio, maybe I'd be doing the same thing for the Packers. I don't know. So I kind of let that one slide. But I do find it interesting, though, that it's not really covered, and I don't think they want to cover because, like you also mentioned, it also goes into gambling. How do you feel confident about gambling when you're not even sure if these games are legit? Or I don't know, maybe that makes it more confident for gambling if you're like, oh, okay, once the playoffs start, I just start
Yeah.
throwing money down on the Chiefs. I mean, does that make it easier? But it just seems like it's not a story that's actually kind of out there. I would have thought you would be on like ESPN. I would have thought, said when I put your name in, I'm like, okay, this person's going to be on ESPN. He's going to be on with Pat McAfee. But no, of course not, because they don't want this out there. And
Yeah,
that's
no,
why I was
and
wondering.
we actually we did send a cold call email to the Pat McAfee show and saying, hey, we found this. Would you want to talk about it and sort of meet with us? And we just never heard anything back. But no, yeah, there's something else that we're thinking about too. Is that like with the past couple weeks of college football, right? Like that's also been really really bad officiating. That is clearly benefiting the financially dominant entities. So yeah, I mean, I think it's something that it's more counter, so sort of more on the counterculture type of circuit, and that's completely fine.
If you were in charge of the NFL, college in terms of like reffing, what would be the changes you'd implement to try to make it a lot more, say, neutral and transparent?
Oh yeah,
Like, what would be
that's a tough question, but I would rely more on technology, just like how the MLB's done, just like how soccer and FIFA's done. I mean, the technology is there now, right? Why are we not using it? Why are we not using the technology to make sure that these outcomes are fair? If we're going to spend 5 minutes reviewing if something was a catch or not, why can't we spend 10 seconds to see if that was a false start? That's how long that would take, by the way. Like if you replayed that, like on some of the tush pushes and stuff, it would take 10 seconds to say, oh, that's a false start, 5-yard penalty. You're like, why are we not doing that? Right. So that would be the biggest change, right? Is let's just start using some technology. There's no reason not to.
every single play in the NFL, there is a penalty. I mean, you have 11 guys on offense, 11 guys on defense. Same thing if the special teams is on. I mean, the fact is, like, how is the offensive linemen are technically probably holding on every play, right? The DBs are out there wrangling with the receivers. I guess the real question is, how do you actually call? It seems like every game is not going to be neutral, just based the fact is there is going to be a penalty. How do you call it? I mean, that was the whole, like, the Legion of Boom with Pete Carroll and the Seattle Seahawks. Basically, is like he told his DBs, like, yeah, just hold every play because the refs aren't going to call a play. But then at the same time, it seems like the league is clearly favoring the offensive players because they want points. The league always talks about how these rules are for player safety. Well, it goes one way. Player safety only if it benefits the offense, we care about player safety. If it benefits the defense, they could care less about player safety. And you mentioned Micah Parsons. I mean, even now that you said I'm from Wisconsin, so I'm a Packers fan. He spoke out recently about how he's basically held every call, and he talked about how the offensive players get special treatment, which is true. I mean, like, he has held every play, but it's like, you don't want to. What are you going to have are you going to throw a flag every single play? Well, no one wants to watch that either. And you mentioned these metrics for referees, which they're not transparent. No one knows. Like, okay, what is the metric? Is it flow of the game? Do you want to call everything? Do you want to have fairness on both sides, or do you fans would get restless if every single play there is a flag? But I don't know, maybe if you did that, maybe eventually players would figure out, like, hey, I can't do this every, like, I think, like, I would love to actually see a game where everything is called. I feel like eventually that game would probably suck, but eventually players would be like, okay, like, they're just going to call it. We're going to have to just play a cleaner game.
Yeah, and if you are implementing that technology, it would definitely sort of throw a big wrench into the flow of the game because if you watch some of the tackles out there, left and right tackles, are notorious for getting an early step on every single play, and they never call it, right? And so, if you're calling that every play, then it's like, okay, now you wait 30 seconds for another play, then you wait 30 seconds for another one. So, yeah, I don't know. The technology would be nice because you're getting it right. But yeah, the flow of the game component would be sort of really messed up.
Since you're mentioning that, I mean, the Chiefs right tackle, Dwan Taylor, is known for basically every time he'd have a false start and they just wouldn't call it. And then
yeah, he's one of the worst out
Yeah.
there. I didn't want to name names, but yeah, he's one of the worst out there. And that's something that we wanted to do, but since it's essentially unobservable, right? Like we wanted to say the Chiefs basically don't get holding calls and they don't get false start calls, like whatsoever. And we wanted to find a way to test that, but since since it's not called, you can't observe it, and then you can't get data on it, right? Unless you're watching like literally every game, which we're not going to do. You can't really do, but yeah, even the calls that are not called are big influences too, and our study completely leaves those out, right? And those, because they're just hard to measure. So that's another big component of what's going on in officiating as well.
Today's guest has been Dr. Spencer Barnes, professor of finance at the University of Texas at El Paso, aka UTEP, who we discussed his latest paper, Under Financial Pressure, that he wrote with a couple co-authors talking about the Kansas City Chiefs. So just two final questions. If you want to let people know where they can find you, where they can find this paper, that information. And then secondly, leave us with a final thought.
Yeah, sounds good. So, I'm on LinkedIn, right? So just Spencer Barnes, UTEP, you'll be able to find me there and some of the work that I'm doing. And then also where you can find this paper, it's published in the Financial Review, which is a finance academic journal. But it has a paywall. So if you can't find it there, you can also find it on a website called SSRN. Which includes publicly available versions of finance and economics papers. And so you can just search it there and you'll be able to find it and read it if you're interested in it. And then, the final thought is I think there's a lot more to do here, right? Like, there's a lot. We can use the NFL, we can use college football, we can use all these sports settings to view differences and outcomes that we might not be able to do for publicly traded companies, but we can still learn some stuff about the way that the world operates. And I think that's a big takeaway from this paper and sort of what we talked about today.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.